Okay, picking back up. This is part 2 of a video or a teaching time on dividing the Founding Brothers. And where we left off, in case you didn't see part 1, of course, if you didn't see part 1, go back and watch part 1. Because it's important stuff, but kind of precursor leading us up here. What we find throughout the whole course, and I would argue today, is this debate right here. What is the founding document of the country? Is it the Declaration? Is it the Constitution? Not surprisingly, Jefferson's going to come down on the side of the Declaration. And for him, it dominates everything else. Adams will be someone who says, well, obviously the philosophy of the Declaration is important. When we're talking about how do we exist as a country, the Constitution is important and perhaps dominates. And so that's kind of going to be a way to look at this back and forth that will happen with the Founding Brothers as they're kind of, arguing and determining like who's right and is something that's being proposed evil. And that's a way for you to kind of think your way through it. So we'll kind of talk to those in a second. Watch this to see if you get an idea.
Talk of a convention in Philadelphia. They are to discuss a binding constitution. I hope to attend if it will have an effect on the style of its prose.
That's John Adams there. That's the actor playing Thomas Jefferson.
I expect that any constitutional document that emerges from Philadelphia will be as compromised as our Declaration of Independence.
There's Franklin. Jefferson was always mad.
Persuaded that the earth belongs exclusively to the living, and that one generation has no more right to bind another to its laws and judgments than one independent nation has the right to command another.
But surely the Constitution, as it did with the ones we wrote for our own states, is meant to establish the stability and the long-term legality essential to the continuation of civilized society.
Yes, possibly. But I fear it could prove a breach in the integrity of our revolutionary ideals, through which will pour the forces of reaction.
So did you catch that last part? Forces of reaction. What Jefferson's concerned about is what Adams is hoping for. Adams is hoping that through the establishment of the Constitution, that there will be a space, he'll say that in just a second, a space that protects civilized society. What Jefferson's thinking about is, for him, the founding document of the country is the Declaration. And so in that area, he says the Declaration allows it to be free. With law, forces of reaction. Well, for him, that means a monarchy. He's really talking about the idea of a centralized government. Too strong of a government can be detrimental, in his opinion, for civilized society. This debate between these two men, captains in 1786, will be the core, then, of what we see dividing the Founding Brothers. All right, so let's hear what Adams says next. Don't forget to listen to the very end about their views on human nature. It's critical.
Dr. Mr. Jefferson's pet topic is not the artful arrangement of political power, but the cordoning off of a space in which no power exists at all. You, sir, you are a walking contradiction.
You're all contradictions, Mr. Hank.
Indeed, yes. And what is government, ultimately, but the putting into effect of the lessons which we have learned in dealing with the contradictions in our own characters?
Of a disconcerting lack of faith in your fellow man, Mr. A, and in yourself, if I may say.
Yes, and you display a dangerous excess of faith in your fellow man, Mr. Jefferson.
Do you hear it? Do you get it right? Jefferson says you have a lack of faith in your fellow man. So in essence, a Lockean worldview. Men or humans are naturally good. Give them space, he's saying. Give them freedom, and then they will never do anything harmful. Adams, Hobbesian, right? You have a disconcerting, too much faith in your fellow man, right? And that's bad, right? Because they're going to betray you. They're going to hurt you. And if you don't have the law, then it'll go crazy. That division between these two men that's why these two men will divide, as we'll see in just a moment. So how much power should the federal government have is going to get played out here under Washington's administration. And in this process, this will lead us to our first political parties. And those political parties and those issues will emerge around these two things here, right? And it's not surprising. I mean, so domestic policy issues, the internal issues of how we deal with money and national domestic stability, tranquility, right, as is written in the Constitution's preamble, and foreign policy. What do we do? And this is not new. I mean, it's still true today. I mean, here, look at this. And these things are back in 10 and 11 and 12. But whether we're talking about fighting about things in Afghanistan or concerns from the New York Times about what's happening in the White House to dealing with our housing bust, the economy is indescribably terrible. Same kind of thing as we're kind of working our way, through the process. And so as you look at what happens under Washington's administration, these 10 things become the policy moments that cause the crisis. And they almost happen in this order. It's not precisely right that they happen in this order, but it's close. So let's kind of look at these really quickly, right? So assumption is Hamilton's attempt to work on the debt. And as you'll see in your research, the location of the U.S. Capitol, which was also a pretty intense issue, ends up being folded together in an arrangement between Hamilton and Jefferson that ultimately puts the Capitol in Virginia. Now that's connected to the idea that the founders believed, all the founders, that the government was best if it could be close to you, physically close. Why? So you could watch it, right? When that ended, everybody's like, okay, that's basically okay. But then the next thing is Hamilton rolls out a plan for the National Bank. This idea of the National Bank was highly controversial amongst the founders, and is really where Jefferson begins to believe he sees kind of a demon in Hamilton and anybody who works with Hamilton, and that would mean Washington. The next thing that happens is Ben Franklin, in one of his very last acts, petitions Congress for the abolition of slavery. It, as you can imagine, is blown off by the Congress, again for the same reason they blew off the conversation of slavery in the first place with the Constitution and ended up with the 3/5 clause, or even back with the Declaration, when it had been in the Declaration of Independence first draft. And so that was kind of, they didn't want to talk about it. So they put on a gag order in Congress, and there's just going to be no conversation about slavery. And that will last us for a long time until we get to about 1820. But then what happens is that's enough. And had that been just those 4 things, we would have seen the division leading to the 2 political parties. But what then happens is this. The French Revolution happens. In basically the same time as we write the Constitution. But for the first years, it doesn't seem like it's a big deal. But if you study the French Revolution, it gets messy really, really quickly. And all of a sudden, there's this thing that happens that begins to impact our domestic policy. First thing that happens is the king will basically lose his head and lose control. And so a new French Revolutionary bound person will become the diplomat from France to the United States. It's this man, Edmond Guéné. Guéné will come, though he'll come with secret orders. And his secret orders are to try and overthrow Washington, just like they had overthrown the king, so that they could attempt to put Thomas Jefferson in as the president. Now, Jefferson, to his credit, never really was involved in this conversation, but to his discredit, he encourages Guéné in some of the actions of Guéné. It's not clear if Jefferson is hoping he can do this and maybe run against Washington in 1892, or maybe that by doing this, it will cause Washington to become more into his viewpoint, Jefferson's viewpoint, but nonetheless, he's supportive of Guéné. And one of the things that Guéné does is he sets up these Democratic Republican societies. Now, the reason that they have this term is because what Guéné's doing is setting up what was in the French Revolution called the Jacobin, or you'll see it's spelled like J-A-C-O-B, so Jacob. But it's not Jacob, it's Jaco, like with the ya. Jacobin societies, which has a lot to do in French Revolution and meant nothing to Americans. So Guéné's like, well, I can't use that name. So what he does is he says, I know. We'll try to take the word republic, because that's important to the country, and we'll add the idea of democratic principle, and we'll set up these societies. Please note, at this point, there's no Democratic Republican political party, and there won't be, as I'll show you in just a second. These societies began basically demanding Washington and the United States get involved in the current war between France and England. Washington will have nothing to do with it, and instead will proclaim his neutrality. The Neutrality Act, or the Proclamation of Neutrality, will infuriate Jefferson and his supporters, who now are beginning to be known as the Republicans, and they will basically pull out of the government. And so there's this sense of real frustration that occurs at this point. when this goes on, and this is into the second term of Washington, all of a sudden a new tax is passed on whiskey that will lead to, in western Pennsylvania in particular, open rebellion. Now, this idea of rebellion isn't unusual for us because we've seen this already. The whole idea of rebellion, as we talked about, is one of the four major themes of kind of the American DNA. And we'd seen it in everything from Bacon's Rebellion up through the thing that kind of led to the Revolutionary Wars, and then, of course, the rebellion in Massachusetts that led to the kind of decision we need to write a new constitution, Shays' Rebellion. All right. So the Whiskey Rebellion was to say, hey, we haven't been Texas. Now, there's an important thing I want to get here, and then probably going to have a part 3 on this video, which is fine. But that Washington is incensed that these guys are rebelling. Because in his mind, hey, look, we have a Congress. They voted. You had a vote. You had to say so. Your side lost. Too bad. Maybe later we can undo the tax. And what he's missing, or what I think the Whiskey Rebellion really demonstrates, is that the American Revolution was about nothing more than control. And the idea of who gets to make the rules, make the laws. And now, Shays had the same argument as the Whiskey Rebellion people. They're going to continue to push down that road of, I guess we would say, independent thought for individuals. So that, in essence, no Congress or no, whether it's a parliament in London or a Congress in Washington, D.C., will be allowed to pass a law on me that takes taxes on me unless I personally agree to it or am willing to do it. And if I'm not willing to do it, you can't make me. And that idea is, again, one of these challenges of having this spirit of rebellion that's inherent in the Americans. And again, shows that the American Revolution wasn't really about the things we talk about in middle school, but instead was more crass down to the level of sheer control. Now, the Whiskey Rebellion is put down by Washington. He'll march an army out there. They'll arrest a bunch of people. A bunch of people are going to be convicted and tried and be put on, should be killed for treason. Washington will commute the sentences no, I'm not going to kill them. But nonetheless, it was this kind of dicey moment that these Democratic Republican societies were hoping for, that people would rise up against Washington. The last thing that happens at this point then is that to try to get peace with England, who was frustrated about the war and worried we would get involved, he sends Supreme Court Chief Justice John Jay to London to get a new treaty that would kind of supplement the 1783 Treaty of Paris that had ended the American Revolution. It wasn't a good treaty. It doesn't look good. And it ends up being really controversial. And that controversy will be part of what makes Washington really frustrated and wanting to get out. Because he's seen now that even as we're at this high moment where we all agree, yay, we have a constitution, really quickly, these questions about what does it mean to live in a republic are going to ultimately be almost unanswerable, and the contention that will arise between people pulling for their view of what's best is going to, cause conflict. All right, so I'm going to stop here. There's one more bit I want to show you, part 3. Hang on. Come back to that one.